Welcome, and thank you for being here. You are listening to Sleeping History, a channel dedicated to calm and steady journeys through the past. If you enjoy these long-form historical stories, you can like the video and subscribe to support the channel. Now, let us move quietly into history and explore interesting facts about the plague, focusing only on what is known, observed, and recorded. The plague is an infectious disease caused by a bacterium that is known today as Yersinia pestis. For most of history, people had no understanding of bacteria or infection. Instead, they relied on observation, tradition, and belief to explain illness. Early references to plague-like diseases appear in ancient records from China, India, and the Mediterranean region, suggesting that the disease has affected human populations for thousands of years. In early societies, disease was often linked to spiritual or environmental causes. Many believed illness came from divine punishment or from corrupted air. This idea of polluted air became known as miasma and strongly influenced how people thought about disease. Because of this belief, efforts to prevent illness often focused on smells, smoke, and ventilation, rather than on physical contact or hygiene. Physicians in the ancient world carefully observed symptoms, even though they did not understand the cause. They noted fever, weakness, vomiting, and painful swellings that appeared near lymph nodes. These swellings, later called buboes, became one of the most recognizable signs of the plague. Despite careful observation, treatments were limited and rarely successful. One of the earliest well-documented plague pandemics occurred in the 6th century and is known today as the Plague of Justinian. It began during the reign of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian the Phaeton and spread through trade routes connecting Africa, Asia, and Europe. Grain shipments, especially those transported by sea, played an important role in spreading the disease, as they often carried rats and fleas. Cities with large ports were particularly affected. Fleas living on rats carried the plague bacterium and passed it to humans through bites. Once the disease entered a city, it spread quickly through crowded neighborhoods. Contemporary accounts describe streets filled with the sick and dying, and a sudden collapse of normal daily life. The population loss during this period weakened the Byzantine Empire. Fewer workers meant reduced food production, lower tax income, and difficulty maintaining the army. Although the empire survived, it never fully recovered its earlier strength, showing how disease can change the course of history. Several centuries later, the plague returned on an even larger scale during the 14th century. This outbreak became known as the Black Death. It likely began in Central or East Asia and traveled west along trade routes used by merchants and caravans. By the time it reached Europe, it spread rapidly from port cities to inland towns and villages. It is estimated that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population died during this period. Entire communities disappeared, leaving behind empty houses and abandoned fields. The sudden loss of life created labor shortages, which eventually changed social and economic structures. Survivors often found they could demand better wages and conditions. The illness itself progressed quickly. Many people developed fever and chills, followed by painful swellings and dark patches on the skin caused by internal bleeding. Death often occurred within a few days. The speed of the disease made it difficult for communities to respond effectively. Daily life changed dramatically during plague outbreaks. Markets closed, travel slowed, and public gatherings were reduced or banned entirely. People avoided contact with others whenever possible, especially those showing visible signs of illness. In some towns, infected houses were marked to warn others. Early forms of quarantine developed during this time. Ships arriving at ports were sometimes required to wait for a set period before unloading cargo or passengers. This practice, which later became standard public health policy, helped reduce the spread of disease even before its cause was understood. Medical treatment during the medieval period was based on the theory of the four humors. Health was believed to depend on a balance between blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Treatments aimed to restore balance through methods such as bloodletting, purging, and herbal remedies. Physicians often wore long robes and protective masks filled with aromatic substances. These masks were designed to filter out bad air rather than germs. While ineffective against infection, they reflected the medical beliefs of the time and became one of the lasting visual symbols of plague outbreaks. The plague appeared in several forms. The most common was bubonic plague, marked by swollen lymph nodes. Septicemic plague infected the bloodstream and could cause rapid organ failure. Pneumonic plague affected the lungs and was especially dangerous because it could spread directly from person to person through coughing. Pneumonic plague outbreaks were often shorter but more intense. Because the disease could spread through the air, crowded areas were particularly vulnerable. Mortality rates were high, and communities struggled to contain these outbreaks. Although Europe is often the focus of plague history, the disease affected many other regions. Large outbreaks occurred in the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia. In China, repeated outbreaks were recorded over centuries and may have contributed to population decline and political instability. Scholars in the Islamic world carefully documented symptoms and debated whether the plague was contagious. Some writings show an early understanding that proximity to the sick increased risk, even if the mechanism was not known. Over time, repeated outbreaks led to gradual improvements in public health. Cities began to invest in sanitation, waste removal, and cleaner water supplies. Authorities kept records of deaths and monitored disease patterns more closely. By the 18th century, major plague pandemics became less frequent in Europe. Improved housing, reduced rat populations, and stricter quarantine laws helped limit the spread. In the 19th century, scientists finally identified the plague bacterium, confirming what had long been observed through experience. With the development of antibiotics in the 20th century, the plague became a treatable disease when caught early. Although small outbreaks still occur in some parts of the world, they are usually contained and closely monitored. Today, the plague is remembered as one of the most significant diseases in human history. Its effects can be seen in historical records, population changes, and social transformations. Studying the plague helps historians and scientists understand how disease shapes societies over time, often quietly, leaving lasting changes long after outbreaks have ended. The long history of the plague also influenced how communities recorded information. During and after outbreaks, many towns began keeping more detailed records of deaths and burials. These records later became valuable sources for historians, allowing patterns of disease spread to be studied centuries later. Mass graves were common during severe outbreaks, especially when death rates exceeded the ability of communities to conduct individual burials. Archaeological discoveries of these burial sites have provided physical evidence of plague victims. Modern testing of remains has confirmed the presence of Yersinia pestis DNA in many of these sites. The repeated return of the plague meant that fear of its arrival became a constant part of life in some regions. People learned to recognize early warning signs, such as increased rat deaths or sudden illness among travelers. While these signs were not always reliable, they shaped how communities reacted to potential outbreaks. Trade routes continued to play a major role in spreading the disease. Overland routes and sea lanes connected distant regions, allowing goods, people, and infections to move together. Even as trade brought wealth and cultural exchange, it also carried serious risks. Some cities attempted to control this risk by creating dedicated quarantine stations. These facilities were often located on islands or outside city walls. Travelers and goods were held there for weeks to ensure no signs of illness appeared. This practice helped reduce outbreaks and became a foundation for later public health systems. Animals were not fully understood as carriers of disease, but people noticed patterns. Rats were often seen in large numbers before outbreaks, and their sudden disappearance sometimes preceded human illness. Despite these observations, the connection between rats, fleas, and plague remained unclear until scientific advances centuries later. Climate and environmental conditions also influenced plague outbreaks. Periods of heavy rain or drought could affect rodent populations, increasing contact between animals and humans. Changes in climate may have contributed to the timing and severity of some historical pandemics. The social impact of the plague extended beyond health. Fear of infection altered relationships between neighbors, families, and social classes. In some cases, the sick were abandoned, while in others, communities worked together to provide care despite the risks. Hospitals and infirmaries expanded during plague periods, though their ability to cure patients was limited. Care often focused on comfort rather than recovery. Religious institutions frequently provided support, offering shelter and burial services when civil systems were overwhelmed. The experience of repeated outbreaks led to changes in urban design. Cities gradually widened streets, improved drainage, and regulated waste disposal. These changes were not always made with disease prevention in mind, but they reduced conditions that allowed infections to spread. The plague also influenced legal systems. New laws were introduced to enforce quarantines, regulate travel, and manage property left behind by the dead. Governments gained more authority to intervene during public health emergencies, setting precedents still used today. In literature and art, the plague left a quiet but lasting mark. Writings from affected periods often reflect themes of loss, uncertainty, and the passage of time. While not always describing the disease directly, these works show how deeply it affected daily life. As medical science advanced, researchers began studying plague outbreaks more systematically. By the late 19th century, scientists isolated the bacterium responsible and identified its transmission cycle. This discovery confirmed many long-held observations and corrected earlier misunderstandings. Vaccines were developed, though they were not always widely used. Antibiotics later became the most effective treatment, greatly reducing death rates when administered early. These medical tools transformed the plague from a widespread killer into a manageable disease. Despite this progress, the plague never fully disappeared. It continues to exist in animal populations in certain parts of the world. Occasional human cases remind scientists and health officials that the disease remains part of the natural environment. Modern monitoring systems track outbreaks closely, allowing rapid response. Public awareness, improved sanitation, and access to medical care have greatly reduced the threat compared to earlier centuries. Looking back, the history of the plague shows how deeply disease can shape human life. It influenced population growth, economic systems, medical knowledge, and government authority. Its effects unfolded slowly, often unnoticed at first, but with lasting consequences. These steady facts from history reflect a world learning through experience, adapting over time, and leaving behind records that still speak quietly to those who listen. Over time, the study of past plague outbreaks has helped scientists understand how diseases move between animals and humans. This field of study, known as zoonotic disease research, draws heavily on historical examples. The plague remains one of the clearest cases of how animal populations can affect human health. Genetic studies of ancient plague strains have shown that the bacterium has changed very little over centuries. This stability helps explain why descriptions of symptoms from medieval sources still closely match modern medical observations. It also allows researchers to trace how different outbreaks were connected across regions. The spread of the plague often followed predictable paths. Rivers, roads, and shipping lanes acted as natural channels for movement. Cities located at crossroads of trade were repeatedly exposed, while more isolated communities sometimes escaped entirely or experienced delayed outbreaks. Population recovery after major outbreaks was slow. In many areas, it took generations for numbers to return to previous levels. This long recovery period reshaped family structures, land ownership, and patterns of settlement. In rural regions, abandoned farmland sometimes reverted to forest or grassland. This environmental change affected wildlife populations, which in turn influenced future disease patterns. These subtle shifts show how closely human activity and the natural world are linked. The memory of the plague was passed down through customs and local traditions. Annual ceremonies, changes in burial practices, and community rules reflected lessons learned during earlier outbreaks. Even when the immediate danger faded, these practices remained. Education around disease gradually improved. Medical texts began to compare different outbreaks, noting similarities and differences. Although the true cause was still unknown, this comparative approach marked an important step toward modern epidemiology. Public trust in authorities often depended on how outbreaks were handled. Effective quarantines and clear rules helped maintain order, while confusion or delay sometimes led to unrest. These experiences influenced how later governments approached public health. As cities expanded in the modern era, lessons from the plague encouraged investment in clean water systems and organized waste removal. These changes reduced not only plague risk, but many other infectious diseases as well. Historical plague outbreaks also influenced migration. Survivors sometimes moved to less crowded areas, spreading populations more evenly across regions. This movement contributed to the growth of new towns and the decline of others. In scientific research today, plague samples from soil, animals, and historical remains continue to be studied. These studies help improve detection methods and prepare responses to future outbreaks of similar diseases. The long history of the plague reminds us that disease is not only a medical event, but a social one. It affects how people live together, how cities are built, and how knowledge is shared across generations. Though the plague no longer shapes daily life as it once did, its presence in historical records remains steady and clear. The facts recorded over centuries offer a quiet account of resilience, adaptation, and gradual understanding. This steady movement through history shows how much has changed and how much has been learned from observing the same disease across time. The careful study of the plague has also shaped how historians interpret other historical events. Population declines caused by outbreaks help explain sudden economic shifts, changes in warfare, and interruptions in construction or trade. When timelines are examined closely, periods of plague often align with moments of major transition. In many regions, records show that children born after large outbreaks experienced different opportunities than those before. With fewer people competing for land or work, some families saw improved living conditions. These changes did not happen immediately, but slowly unfolded over decades. The role of animals in maintaining the plague became clearer in the modern era. Certain wild rodents can carry the bacterium without becoming seriously ill. This allows the disease to persist quietly in nature, even when human cases are rare. Because of this, the plague is now understood as part of a larger ecological system. Human outbreaks are usually the result of environmental changes that increase contact between people and infected animals. This understanding has helped health authorities focus on prevention rather than reaction. Museums and archives around the world preserve objects connected to plague history. Medical tools, clothing, written accounts, and artwork provide physical links to the past. These items help researchers reconstruct daily life during outbreaks with greater accuracy. The language used to describe disease also evolved through plague experiences. Many medical terms and public health concepts originated during repeated attempts to control outbreaks. Words related to quarantine, infection, and prevention gained clearer meaning over time. As centuries passed, the plague gradually shifted from a constant threat to a subject of study. Advances in science transformed fear into understanding. What was once mysterious became measurable, observable, and treatable. Still, the historical impact remains clear. The plague influenced how societies value health, organize cities, and respond collectively to danger. These lessons were learned slowly through repeated loss and careful observation. When reading historical accounts, one theme appears again and again: adaptation. Communities adjusted their behavior, laws, and environments in response to the disease. Over time, these adjustments reduced the impact of future outbreaks. Today, the plague stands as a reminder of how knowledge grows. Each generation built upon the observations of the last, turning experience into understanding. The facts preserved in history show a steady progression rather than sudden change. This long record of the plague moves quietly through time, marked by careful notes, altered habits, and gradual improvement. It remains one of the clearest examples of how humanity learns by watching, recording, and remembering. As research continues, scientists compare historical plague outbreaks with modern disease patterns. By doing so, they gain insight into how infections spread in different environments and populations. These comparisons help refine models used to predict and prevent future outbreaks of infectious disease. The preservation of written records has been especially important. Diaries, city logs, and medical notes provide details that numbers alone cannot show. They reveal how ordinary people experienced the plague, how quickly fear spread, and how daily routines were altered in subtle ways. Burial practices changed permanently in many regions after repeated outbreaks. Cemeteries were often moved outside city walls, reducing crowding within urban centers. This shift improved sanitation and reduced exposure to disease, even though the original motivation was practical rather than scientific. Over time, communities learned that early action mattered. Closing city gates, limiting gatherings, and isolating the sick became accepted responses. Although these measures were imperfect, they reduced the scale of some outbreaks and saved lives. The plague also influenced how time was recorded. In some areas, calendars and local histories marked years by outbreaks rather than political events. This shows how deeply the disease affected collective memory. In rural areas, oral traditions preserved knowledge of past outbreaks. Stories passed between generations often included warnings about travel, contact, or seasonal risks. While not always precise, these stories carried practical lessons shaped by experience. Scientific understanding eventually replaced superstition, but the transition was slow. Old beliefs coexisted with new ideas for centuries. This overlap reflects how knowledge evolves gradually rather than suddenly. As global travel increased in the modern era, the lessons of the plague became even more important. Health inspections at borders, reporting systems, and international cooperation all trace part of their origin to past struggles with widespread disease. Today, plague bacteria are studied in controlled laboratory settings. These studies focus on how the bacterium survives, spreads, and responds to treatment. This work continues to improve preparedness for rare but possible outbreaks. Despite its long history, the plague is now a quiet presence. It exists mostly in records, research, and limited natural reservoirs. Modern medicine has reduced its threat, but its historical importance remains unchanged. The story of the plague is not one of sudden endings, but of long adjustment. Across centuries, people observed, recorded, and adapted. Slowly, understanding replaced fear. These steady facts remain preserved in history, offering a calm record of how humanity responded to one of its greatest challenges, and how knowledge, over time, brought clarity to what was once unknown. Even now, historians continue to revisit plague records with new tools and methods. Advances in technology allow old documents to be re-examined and compared across regions. This has revealed connections between outbreaks that were once thought to be separate events. Maps created from historical data show how waves of disease moved over time. These visual records confirm what written accounts suggested. The plague did not spread randomly, but followed human movement and settlement patterns. Understanding this has helped modern researchers see how closely disease follows everyday life. The plague also influenced how communities thought about responsibility. Over time, the idea grew that protecting health was not only an individual concern, but a shared one. This shift laid early foundations for public health systems that serve entire populations. In many places, the experience of the plague encouraged cooperation between cities and regions. Shared rules for quarantine and travel slowly replaced isolated responses. These agreements reduced conflict and improved safety during later outbreaks. The long presence of the plague in history reminds us that change often happens quietly. Improvements in health, safety, and knowledge did not arrive all at once. They developed through repeated observation, careful record-keeping, and small adjustments made over many generations. When viewed from a distance, the plague becomes part of a broader historical pattern. It shows how humans respond to uncertainty, how societies adapt under pressure, and how understanding grows over time. The facts that remain today are steady and clear. They tell of a disease that once shaped daily life, and of people who learned, slowly and patiently, how to live alongside risk while working toward greater safety. These records rest quietly in history, continuing to inform and remind long after the outbreaks themselves have passed. The continued interest in the plague reflects a broader effort to understand how past events shape the present. By studying long-term patterns, historians can see how repeated exposure to disease influenced planning, governance, and scientific curiosity. University studies and public archives now make many plague records accessible to researchers and students. This openness allows new interpretations to emerge, sometimes correcting older assumptions. As more sources are compared, the picture of how societies experience the plague becomes clearer and more balanced. The plague also helped define the role of observation in medicine. Careful noting of symptoms, outcomes, and conditions laid groundwork for later scientific methods. Even without modern tools, early observers contributed valuable knowledge simply by recording what they saw. Over centuries, this accumulation of facts reduced uncertainty. What began as fear and speculation gradually became structured understanding. Each outbreak added to a growing body of experience that informed future responses. In this way, the history of the plague is also a history of learning. It shows how information passes from one generation to the next, slowly shaping better outcomes. Though the disease itself caused immense loss, the knowledge gained had lasting value. Today, the plague stands quietly in historical study, no longer a constant threat, but a clear example of how humanity responds to challenge. Its record remains steady, factual, and enduring, offering insight into the past without urgency and resting calmly within the long flow of history. As attention gradually shifted to other concerns, the plague became part of background history rather than immediate experience. Its presence was no longer felt in daily routines, but in archives, studies, and the structure of institutions shaped by earlier outbreaks. The lessons learned were absorbed into standard practice. Clean water systems, regulated waste disposal, health reporting, and coordinated responses became normal features of organized society. These developments were not always directly attributed to the plague, but they grew from centuries of experience with disease. In historical study, the plague now serves as a reference point. It helps explain why certain rules exist, why cities are built as they are, and why public health is treated as a shared responsibility. Its influence is steady rather than dramatic. When viewed across long periods of time, the plague appears less as a single event and more as a recurring presence that shaped gradual change. Its impact unfolded slowly, through observation, adaptation, and record-keeping. These quiet facts remain preserved in history, offering a clear and measured account of how people responded, learned, and adjusted. The plague rests now as part of the past, understood through careful study and remembered through the steady record of human experience. With fewer outbreaks to record, references to the plague became less frequent in everyday writing. Mentions shifted from urgent notices to reflective accounts, often included in broader histories of towns, regions, or families. The disease moved from lived reality into remembered experience. This change allowed historians to compare periods of crisis with times of stability. By doing so, they could see how societies functioned before, during, and after repeated outbreaks. These comparisons revealed how deeply disease influenced planning, behavior, and long-term development. In many ways, the plague helped define the importance of preparation. Systems created to manage outbreaks were later adapted for other emergencies. What began as a response to one disease became a framework for managing many risks. The study of the plague continues quietly, not because of immediate danger, but because of its value as a historical example. It shows how knowledge accumulates, how mistakes are corrected, and how understanding improves over time. As history moves forward, the plague remains a steady reference in the background. Its facts are recorded, its patterns understood, and its lessons absorbed. the long record stands complete, resting calmly within the wider story of human history. As generations passed, the plague became something learned about rather than lived through. Its presence remained in textbooks, lectures, and preserved documents, studied with distance and care. This distance allowed clearer understanding, free from the urgency that once surrounded it. The accumulated knowledge from centuries of observation now rests quietly in historical study. What was once confusing and overwhelming is now organized into timelines, maps, and explanations. The disease that once moved unseen through crowded streets is now understood through facts carefully gathered over time. In this way, the history of the plague settles into stillness. It no longer interrupts daily life, but it continues to inform how societies think about health, risk, and responsibility. Its record remains calm and steady, held within history, unchanged and complete. With this understanding in place, the plague remains part of history rather than the present. Its details are preserved in records, studied carefully, and used to explain how societies grow through experience. What once spread silently is now traced, measured, and understood. The facts remain steady. They describe a disease that shaped populations, influenced systems, and encouraged careful observation over time. Nothing about this history rushes. It unfolds slowly, one record after another, forming a complete picture. And so the story rests here, within the long flow of the past, unchanged and quietly remembered. The record of the plague remains settled in history, studied without urgency and preserved without change. Its presence is marked by facts rather than fear, by observation rather than uncertainty. Each account adds to a long and steady understanding built across centuries. What endures is not the disease itself, but the knowledge shaped around it. Careful notes, altered habits, and gradual improvements formed a response that extended far beyond any single outbreak. This quiet accumulation of understanding continues to influence how the past is read and how the present is prepared. In this way, the history of the plague comes to rest, complete, and unchanged, held calmly within the wider story of human experience. The study of the plague now sits alongside other long histories, neither distant nor urgent, simply observed. Its place is secure within records that do not change, even as understanding becomes clearer with time. The facts remain, steady and complete. Through these records, the past stays accessible. The plague no longer moves through cities or alters daily life, but it continues to exist as knowledge, preserved carefully and without disturbance. Here the history remains still, resting quietly in the background, unchanged, and at ease within the long passage of time. The historical record allows even more detail to be traced, especially when smaller local outbreaks are examined. Not every instance of plague was a sweeping pandemic. Many outbreaks were limited to single towns or regions, lasting months rather than years. These smaller events still disrupted daily life and added to the collective understanding of disease. Local authorities often responded differently depending on experience. Towns that had faced plague before tended to act more quickly, closing gates, limiting trade, and isolating the sick. Places with no prior experience were often slower to respond, allowing the disease to spread more widely before measures were taken. Written correspondence from these periods shows how information traveled. Letters warned neighboring towns of rising deaths or unusual illness. This early form of disease reporting helped some communities prepare, even if they did not fully understand what they were facing. Economic effects extended beyond immediate loss of life. Trade interruptions caused shortages of goods such as grain, cloth, and tools. Prices fluctuated, sometimes rising sharply due to scarcity. These disruptions could last years after an outbreak had ended. Craft guilds and local trades were affected unevenly. Some professions nearly disappeared in heavily affected areas, while others gained importance. Gravediggers, caretakers, and medical workers became essential, even though their work carried high risk. Family structures were also altered. Many children lost parents, and extended families stepped in to provide care. Inheritance patterns changed as sudden deaths redistributed property and land, sometimes leading to long legal disputes. In religious institutions, repeated outbreaks influenced practices around burial, prayer, and charity. Monasteries and churches often acted as centers of aid, providing food and shelter. At the same time, the loss of clergy forced changes in how services were conducted. Over centuries, artistic representation of death became more restrained and symbolic. Rather than direct depictions of suffering, art began to reflect absence, memory, and time passing. These shifts mirror how societies gradually processed the long presence of disease. Scientific curiosity continued to grow alongside these experiences. By comparing outbreaks in different climates and seasons, observers noticed patterns. Plague often appeared in warmer months and declined in colder ones, though exceptions existed. These observations contributed to early theories about environmental influence. Ports remained a focal point of concern well into the modern era. Even after major outbreaks declined, ships were inspected carefully. Health documents, later called bills of health, became standard for travel and trade. The persistence of these practices shows how deeply the plague shaped routine systems. Long after the danger faded, the structures remained, quietly protecting against future risk. The accumulated history of the plague is therefore not confined to moments of crisis. It lives in rules, habits, records, and built environments. Its influence is spread thinly across time, steady and continuous, rather than concentrated in a single moment. These extended facts continue to rest within history, offering a calm and detailed account of how people observed, adapted, and learned, slowly and patiently, across generations. Smaller outbreaks continued to appear even as large pandemics became less common. These local events were often carefully recorded, especially in towns with established councils or medical officers. Death registers listed names, dates, and sometimes causes, creating detailed timelines of how illness moved through a community. Seasonal patterns were observed repeatedly. In many regions, plague cases increased during warmer months and declined in winter. Although the reason was not understood at the time, these observations were consistent enough to influence planning and response. Markets, fairs, and large gatherings were sometimes delayed when illness was suspected. Housing conditions played an important role. Overcrowded homes with poor ventilation allowed disease to spread more easily. As cities rebuilt after outbreaks, some regulations were introduced to limit crowding and improve airflow. These changes were gradual but meaningful over long periods. Waste management also became a focus. Refuse, animal remains, and standing water were increasingly regulated. While these efforts were often aimed at reducing bad smells, they unintentionally reduced environments where rats and fleas thrived. Medical training slowly improved through shared experience. Physicians compared notes across regions, discussing symptoms and outcomes. Although cures remained limited, diagnosis became more consistent. This helped authorities respond more confidently, even without full understanding. Plague hospitals, sometimes built outside city walls, became more common. These facilities separated the sick from the general population. Conditions were often basic, but isolation reduced wider spread. The idea of separating illness from daily life became a lasting principle in healthcare. In some areas, laws required households to report sickness immediately. Failure to do so could result in fines or punishment. These rules reflected growing recognition that early action mattered more than secrecy. The presence of the plague also influenced timekeeping and memory. Years were remembered by whether sickness occurred, and family histories often referenced outbreaks as turning points. These quiet markers shaped how people understood their own lives within a larger pattern. As centuries passed, scientific methods brought clarity to earlier observations. The identification of bacteria confirmed why isolation, cleanliness, and reduced contact had been effective. Practices shaped by trial and error were given clear explanation. The plague's long history is therefore not a single story, but many overlapping ones. It moved through cities and villages, records and memories, laws and buildings. Its influence spread slowly and settled deeply. These steady details continue to exist within history, forming a complete and unbroken account. They remain calm, factual, and unchanged, resting quietly within the long record of human experience. In addition to written records, physical traces of the plague remain embedded in landscapes. Some roads, boundary markers, and isolated buildings were originally established to control movement during outbreaks. These features later became ordinary parts of towns and countryside, long after their original purpose was forgotten. Rural communities often experience the plague differently from cities. Lower population density sometimes slowed transmission, but limited access to care increased risk once illness appeared. Farms could be left unattended for entire seasons, affecting food supply well beyond the immediate area. Livestock was generally not affected by the plague itself, but the loss of human labor made animal care difficult. This imbalance sometimes led to changes in farming practices, with less labor-intensive methods becoming more common over time. The psychological impact of repeated outbreaks was rarely discussed directly, but it can be inferred from behavior. People became cautious about travel, gatherings, and strangers. Trust was often reserved for close family or long-known neighbors, shaping social boundaries. Over generations, this caution softened as outbreaks became less frequent. Gradually, restrictions loosened, travel resumed, and markets returned to regular schedules. Life did not return to exactly what it had been before, but it found a new balance shaped by experience. Medical language also became more precise. Symptoms were described with greater consistency, allowing patterns to be recognized across regions. This shared language helped connect observations made far apart in time and place. As printing became more widespread, information about outbreaks traveled faster. Pamphlets, notices, and official statements informed the public about risks and rules. This wider communication reduced uncertainty and limited rumor. The role of government expanded quietly through these measures. Managing health became part of civic responsibility. This shift happened gradually, without clear beginnings or endings, but it changed how authority was understood. In later centuries, when new diseases appeared, responses were influenced by plague history. Isolation, reporting, and coordinated action were already familiar ideas. The past provided a framework for the present. Historians now study these continuities carefully. They note how responses evolved rather than appearing suddenly. Each small change built upon earlier experience, forming systems that still exist today. The plague's presence in history is therefore layered. It exists in medical study, urban design, law, and memory. It does not dominate these areas, but it quietly informs them. These accumulated facts remain steady. They describe not only a disease, but a long process of observation and adaptation. The record does not hurry. It moves slowly, reflecting the pace at which understanding itself developed. And so the history continues to rest within the past, detailed and complete, offering a calm account of how societies learned, adjusted, and carried that knowledge forward across time. The influence of the plague can also be traced in language used by later generations. Certain expressions, place names, and local terms originated during times of sickness. Over time, their original meaning faded, but they remained part of everyday speech, quietly linking the present to the past. In some regions, buildings once used for isolation were later repurposed. Former plague houses became storage spaces, homes, or public buildings. Their history was often forgotten by later occupants, yet the structures themselves remained, shaped by earlier needs. Education systems eventually included the plague as part of historical learning. Rather than focusing on fear or loss, lessons emphasized cause, response, and outcome. This shift reflected growing confidence in human ability to understand and manage disease. The careful preservation of documents has allowed patterns to be confirmed repeatedly. When records from different countries are compared, similarities appear in timing, response, and recovery. These shared patterns show how connected societies were, even when communication was slow. Environmental studies have added further detail. Soil samples, tree rings, and climate records help explain why certain periods saw increased outbreaks. These natural records complement written history, offering a broader view of conditions at the time. As understanding deepened, the plague became a reference point for measuring progress. Improvements in medicine, sanitation, and communication were often compared against earlier centuries when such tools did not exist. This comparison highlighted gradual advancement rather than sudden change. The absence of frequent outbreaks in modern times has allowed historians to examine the plague with patience. Without urgency, details can be studied carefully and conclusions refined over time. This slow approach mirrors the calm pace at which knowledge itself developed. The plague's history also reminds researchers of the importance of humility. Many early theories were sincere but incorrect. Later discoveries corrected them, showing that understanding evolves and improves through careful testing and observation. Across centuries, one constant remains clear: information mattered. Communities that observed, recorded, and shared knowledge were better prepared over time. This simple principle underlies much of what is now considered modern public health. The long presence of the plague shaped habits that became invisible through familiarity. Clean streets, regulated markets, and health oversight became ordinary, even though they emerged from repeated experience with disease. These quiet outcomes are easy to overlook, yet they form part of the lasting legacy. The plague's impact did not end when outbreaks stopped. It continued through systems, habits, and shared understanding. The record that remains is steady and complete. It shows a disease moving through history, met by observation rather than certainty, and answered by gradual adaptation. This calm accumulation of facts rests within the past, unchanged, offering a clear and measured account of how people learned, step by step, across long stretches of time. Over the centuries, the plague left traces in both physical and social landscapes. Certain roads, walls, and city layouts were shaped by efforts to control movement during outbreaks. Even after the immediate threat passed, these structures remained, quietly influencing how people lived and traveled. Communities adapted their routines in subtle ways. Seasonal work, market schedules, and travel patterns were adjusted to reduce risk, even if the exact reason for safety was not fully understood. These changes often persisted long after the plague itself had receded. Records of households and families grew more detailed. Deaths, inheritances, and family movements were noted carefully, allowing communities to track population changes over time. These records later provided historians with insight into how societies recovered and adjusted after loss. The plague also influenced diet and agriculture. Labor shortages meant that less labor-intensive crops and livestock were preferred, and farming practices shifted gradually. Surplus storage and trade practices were adjusted to reduce vulnerability in future crises. Public spaces were affected as well. Streets, marketplaces, and communal areas were reorganized to improve airflow and reduce crowding. What began as a measure against disease became a lasting part of urban design, often unnoticed in later centuries. Cultural memory preserved lessons from the plague in stories, proverbs, and local customs. Warnings about sickness, cleanliness, and isolation became embedded in tradition. Even when people no longer faced outbreaks regularly, these customs continued to guide behavior. Medical understanding advanced slowly. Physicians compared notes, debated causes, and refined diagnosis methods. Although treatments remained limited, recording symptoms consistently allowed a foundation for later scientific study. The careful attention of these early observers contributed to eventual breakthroughs in bacteriology. By the 19th and 20th centuries, scientific methods clarified many earlier observations. Researchers traced plague bacteria in both human remains and animal reservoirs, confirming centuries of anecdotal knowledge. This verification reinforced the value of careful observation and record-keeping. Despite the decline of widespread outbreaks, the plague remained present in isolated regions, maintained in wild rodent populations. Modern monitoring ensures these areas are observed, but the disease no longer spreads uncontrollably as it once did. The lasting influence of the plague is therefore quiet but pervasive. It shaped infrastructure, law, social behavior, medical practice, and cultural memory. These effects unfolded slowly, layer by layer, leaving behind a stable record of human adaptation. History preserves these facts calmly, allowing the plague to remain a reference point for understanding society, health, and resilience across centuries. Its legacy is measured, complete, and quietly held within the long flow of time. Even as modern medicine reduced the immediate threat of the plague, its historical presence continued to inform society. Scholars and physicians studied outbreaks to understand patterns of disease, transmission, and mortality. These studies helped shape responses to new epidemics, providing a foundation of knowledge built over centuries. Population studies revealed the long-term effects of repeated outbreaks. Communities that experienced severe mortality often showed changes in demographics for decades afterward. Birth rates, family structures, and labor distribution were all influenced by the loss of life. These patterns could be traced in records and census data, offering insight into social adaptation. Urban planning also reflected lessons learned from the plague. Streets were widened, drainage systems improved, and building regulations gradually incorporated spacing and ventilation considerations. These adjustments reduced the risk of disease spread, even before the specific cause of the plague was known. Trade networks, too, were affected. Merchants developed practices to minimize risk, such as inspection of goods, delayed unloading, and temporary storage away from cities. These practices became standard over time, reflecting careful adaptation rather than abrupt change. The plague's influence on governance was subtle but lasting. Authorities assumed greater responsibility for public welfare, enforcing quarantines, health regulations, and reporting procedures. These measures gradually became accepted norms in civic administration. Cultural memory remained strong. Literature, art, and folklore continued to reflect the presence of disease, often in symbolic or allegorical ways. Even when outbreaks were infrequent, these representations served as reminders of vulnerability and resilience. Medical education evolved from these experiences. Case studies, symptom documentation, and shared observations formed the basis for more systematic approaches to treatment. While cures were limited, understanding of disease progression improved steadily over time. By the 19th century, microbiology confirmed the cause of the plague. Researchers identified Yersinia pestis and traced its transmission through fleas and rodents. This scientific clarity validated centuries of careful observation and linked practical measures, such as isolation and cleanliness, to actual reduction in disease spread. In modern times, the plague is rarely a threat to daily life, yet its history remains instructive. Monitoring, preparedness, and public health systems all draw on lessons learned from past outbreaks. The disease exists as both a biological and historical reference, reminding us of the interplay between humans and their environment. The record of the plague stretches across centuries, steady and uninterrupted. It shows a process of observation, adaptation, and learning, leaving behind a calm, complete, and measured account of how societies endured and adjusted to one of history's most persistent diseases. Even today, the plague continues to be studied as a window into human resilience and adaptation. Researchers examine historical patterns alongside modern outbreaks, looking for connections between environment, human behavior, and disease spread. These studies reveal the importance of preparation, observation, and coordinated action. Lessons first shaped over centuries of experience. Archaeological evidence adds another layer to understanding. Mass graves, skeletal analysis, and DNA studies provide direct insight into the demographics, health, and conditions of past populations. These findings confirm written accounts and offer new information about how quickly outbreaks progressed and whom they affected most. In rural areas, the plague's influence can still be traced through settlement patterns. Villages abandoned during severe outbreaks were sometimes resettled centuries later. Others merged with neighboring communities, altering local geography and social organization. Social customs also adapted in subtle ways. Practices surrounding cleanliness, food preparation, and handling of the sick were influenced by centuries of experience with disease. Over time, these habits became ordinary aspects of daily life, their origins quietly linked to past outbreaks. The plague also shaped attitudes toward risk and health. Repeated exposure to disease fostered cautious behavior, careful observation of symptoms, and a general awareness of how illness could spread. These lessons were passed from generation to generation, sometimes through formal instruction, sometimes through stories and community memory. Even as scientific understanding developed, many practical measures from earlier times remained effective. Isolation, reporting of illness, and monitoring of movement continued to reduce transmission, demonstrating that careful observation had value long before the underlying biology was known. Records from ports and trade centers show the meticulous attention paid to controlling disease spread. Bills of health, quarantine stations, and inspection protocols became standard, allowing commerce to continue while minimizing risk. These practices illustrate how societies learn to balance survival with economic necessity. The long-term influence of the plague extends quietly into modern public health. Surveillance systems, rapid response protocols, and preventive measures all trace conceptual roots back to centuries of experience with outbreaks. These systems exist as structured, steady defenses, reflecting lessons learned slowly over time. Through careful study, the plague's history offers insight not only into the disease itself, but into human adaptation, resilience, and the gradual accumulation of knowledge. Its presence in history is measured and factual, forming a steady record of how societies responded to one of the most persistent challenges in human life. This steady, detailed account rests quietly within the flow of history, showing the patient work of observation, adaptation, and learning that unfolded across generations. Over the centuries, the plague influenced patterns of settlement and urban growth. Towns that were repeatedly affected sometimes saw slower expansion, while nearby villages that avoided outbreaks could grow more steadily. These shifts left lasting marks on population distribution and local economies. In addition, trade practices adapted to reduce risk. Merchants learned to store goods away from population centers, inspect shipments carefully, and delay travel during periods of high illness. These adjustments, made over decades and centuries, gradually became routine and helped reduce the impact of later outbreaks. Health regulations also became more formalized. Authorities established rules for reporting sickness, isolating the ill, and controlling movement in and out of affected areas. These measures were often enforced with fines or penalties, reflecting a growing recognition of shared responsibility for public health. Cultural practices were shaped subtly by repeated exposure to disease. Stories, songs, and local traditions preserved lessons about caution, care, and hygiene. Even when the threat of plague faded, these practices continued to influence behavior, sometimes in ways that were no longer consciously linked to disease. Medical knowledge expanded slowly but steadily. Physicians documented symptoms carefully, compared cases across regions, and refined their understanding of disease progression. Though effective treatments were rare, this detailed observation laid the foundation for later scientific advances in bacteriology and epidemiology. Archaeological evidence continues to complement historical records. Mass graves, skeletal analysis, and preserved artifacts provide insight into the demographics of affected populations, their living conditions, and the speed at which outbreaks progressed. These studies confirm written accounts and add new layers of understanding. Environmental factors were noted repeatedly. Seasonal changes, climate variations, and the presence of rodents all influenced the timing and severity of outbreaks. While early observers could not explain the mechanisms, their careful records helped later scientists recognize patterns in disease ecology. Over time, the plague became a quiet reference point in history. Its lessons influenced city planning, legal systems, public health, and social behavior. Though its immediate threat diminished, its long-term effects shaped how societies approached risk, adaptation, and communal responsibility. The history of the plague is therefore a slow, continuous process. Observation, record-keeping, and cautious adjustment allowed societies to endure repeated crises and gradually reduce their impact. These accumulated facts remain steady and complete, offering a calm, measured view of how humans learn to live with and respond to one of history's most persistent diseases. Even after the most severe outbreaks passed, the presence of the plague continued to influence daily life in quieter ways. Families remained cautious in travel and interaction, especially during certain seasons when illness had historically been more common. These habits, though no longer necessary to the same degree, persisted as part of routine life. Communities maintained records of sickness and death long after immediate outbreaks ended. Parish registers, civic logs, and personal diaries preserved detailed information about who fell ill, who recovered, and who did not. These records became invaluable for understanding long-term demographic patterns and social change. Education about health slowly became more systematic. Over generations, knowledge about isolation, cleanliness, and avoidance of contagion was transmitted through both formal instruction and everyday observation. Even when scientific explanations were limited, these practices reduced the impact of later outbreaks. Urban design reflected lessons from repeated epidemics. Streets were kept cleaner, drainage improved, and marketplaces were organized to reduce overcrowding. Buildings were spaced to allow airflow, and previously common practices that increased risk were gradually abandoned. These changes, though subtle, improved living conditions over time. Trade and commerce adapted as well. Merchants developed safer methods for moving goods, inspecting shipments, and managing warehouses. Long-term experience allowed trade to continue while limiting exposure to disease, illustrating how societies balanced economic necessity with health concerns. Social structures were affected too. Families adapted to sudden loss, forming extended networks for care and support. Local authorities assumed increasing responsibility for public welfare, establishing rules for quarantine, reporting, and care of the sick. These adjustments contributed to the foundation of modern public health systems. Cultural memory preserved awareness of the plague. Stories, traditions, and rituals kept lessons about caution, observation, and care alive across generations. Even as outbreaks became rare, these customs reminded communities of past vulnerability and resilience. Scientific study gradually confirmed what had long been observed. The identification of the plague bacterium and its transmission through fleas and rodents explained centuries of patterns and reinforced the value of measures like isolation and sanitation. Observation, recording, and adaptation, practices honed over generations, were validated by modern understanding. Through all these layers, social, cultural, environmental, and scientific, the plague left a lasting imprint. Its presence shaped behavior, infrastructure, and knowledge, quietly but steadily influencing how societies functioned. The history of the plague thus unfolds as a slow, measured process. It is a record of observation, learning, and adaptation, preserved in documents, habits, and the built environment. These facts remain calm, complete, and quietly enduring within the long flow of human history. Over time, the plague became less of an immediate threat, but its lessons continued to shape society in lasting ways. Communities remained attentive to hygiene, sanitation, and isolation practices, often maintaining these habits long after outbreaks had subsided. These precautions became embedded in daily life, quietly reducing the risk of many other diseases as well. Historical records show that the effects of repeated outbreaks were long-lasting. Population structures, labor distribution, and land ownership were all influenced by mortality patterns. Families adapted to loss, forming wider networks of care, while local authorities adjusted policies to manage resources and maintain order. Trade practices evolved to reduce exposure. Goods were inspected and stored carefully, travel was sometimes delayed, and ports implemented stricter monitoring. These adaptations allowed commerce to continue while minimizing the risk of contagion. The built environment retained marks of these experiences. Streets were widened, drainage systems improved, and marketplaces organized to limit overcrowding. Buildings were designed or modified to allow better airflow, reflecting lessons learned over generations. Even as centuries passed, the plague's influence continued to echo quietly through society. Communities adapted not only in response to immediate outbreaks, but also in preparation for the possibility of future ones. Precautionary measures became habits. Practices of cleanliness, isolation, and careful observation were maintained long after the threat had diminished. Records of families, deaths, and burials remained meticulously kept. These documents allowed communities to track population changes over time, understand the effects of repeated disease, and plan for recovery. Census data and parish registers provide historians today with detailed insight into the social and demographic impact of the plague. Education about health slowly became more formalized. Physicians and scholars shared observations across regions, developing systematic approaches to symptoms, disease progression, and treatment. While cures were limited, the consistent recording of information improved understanding and informed responses to later outbreaks. Urban landscapes continued to bear traces of past experience. Streets were widened, drainage improved, and buildings arranged to reduce crowding and improve airflow. Marketplaces were organized to minimize risk, and regulations surrounding sanitation became more firmly established. These changes, born of centuries of trial and observation, quietly shaped the development of towns and cities. Trade and commerce were also influenced over the long term. Merchants adopted careful inspection of goods, temporary storage, and regulated shipping procedures. These adjustments allowed economic activity to continue, while reducing the chance of disease spread. Long-term habits of caution and observation became embedded in commercial practice. Social customs and cultural memory preserved lessons from the plague. Stories, songs, and local traditions conveyed warnings about disease and encouraged careful behavior. Even after the immediate threat faded, these practices continued to guide communities, reinforcing habits of caution and awareness. The development of scientific understanding further illuminated centuries of accumulated experience. The identification of Yersinia pestis and recognition of its transmission through fleas and rodents confirmed the observations and measures developed over generations. Practices like quarantine, isolation, and sanitation were validated by modern study. The long-term impact of the plague is thus subtle but profound. It shaped population patterns, governance, urban planning, trade practices, and public health systems. Its influence moved slowly and quietly through centuries, becoming embedded in habits, institutions, and collective knowledge. The history of the plague, observed through this slow accumulation of facts and responses, presents a calm and steady account. It is a record of adaptation, learning, and resilience, preserved clearly and completely within the broader flow of human history. Even in regions where the plague became rare, its legacy continued to shape life in subtle ways. people remained mindful of hygiene, food preparation, and isolation of the sick. These habits, reinforced over generations, quietly reduced the risk of many other illnesses as well. Historical records show that repeated outbreaks left long-term effects on population and society. Families adapted to loss, often relying on extended networks for care and support. Land ownership, labor distribution, and inheritance patterns were all influenced by sudden mortality, with effects persisting for decades. Trade and travel practices also reflected these lessons. Merchants implemented careful inspection of goods, delayed travel during periods of risk, and stored items away from population centers. These measures gradually became standard, allowing commerce to continue while minimizing exposure to disease. Urban environments retained visible marks of adaptation. Streets were widened, drainage systems improved, and marketplaces were organized to reduce crowding. Buildings were spaced for ventilation, and regulations regarding sanitation were reinforced. These changes, originating from necessity during outbreaks, became long-term features of city planning. Cultural memory preserved awareness of the plague. Stories, proverbs, and local customs conveyed warnings and lessons, passing from generation to generation. Even when outbreaks were infrequent, these traditions reinforced cautious behavior and communal responsibility. Medical knowledge evolved gradually. Physicians documented symptoms consistently, compared cases across regions, and refined approaches to care. Though effective treatments were limited, these observations laid the groundwork for modern epidemiology and public health practices. Archaeological evidence complements these historical records. Mass graves, skeletal remains, and artifacts provide insight into population health, social organization, and the progression of outbreaks. Together, physical and written evidence offers a comprehensive understanding of the plague's impact. Environmental factors, including seasonal patterns, climate variations, and rodent populations, were noted repeatedly. Early observers recorded these correlations, allowing later scientists to understand ecological influences on disease transmission. Through centuries of observation, adaptation, and careful record-keeping, societies gradually reduced the impact of the plague. It moved from a constant threat to a historical reference, shaping systems, behavior, and knowledge that continue to inform public health today. The history of the plague is therefore steady and continuous. It reflects careful observation, adaptation, and learning across generations, preserved calmly and clearly within the long flow of human history. Even as modern medicine and sanitation largely controlled the plague, its influence continued to shape society in quiet ways. Communities retained habits of caution, cleanliness, and careful observation that had been developed over centuries. These practices persisted, gradually becoming routine elements of daily life, even long after the immediate threat had faded. Population structures continued to reflect the effects of repeated outbreaks. Families adapted to loss, forming wider support networks. Labor distribution, inheritance, and land ownership were all influenced by mortality patterns, creating long-term changes in social and economic organization. Urban planning and architecture bore the imprint of past experiences. Streets were kept cleaner and wider, drainage systems were improved, and buildings were spaced for ventilation. Markets and public spaces were organized to reduce crowding. Reflecting lessons learned over generations, these changes improved health and reduced the spread of not only plague, but many other diseases. Trade and commerce continued to adapt. Merchants implemented inspection protocols, delayed travel when risks were high, and stored goods carefully to limit exposure. These long-term adjustments allowed economic activity to continue while minimizing the risk of disease transmission. Cultural memory preserved lessons from the plague. Stories, proverbs, and local traditions conveyed warnings and practical advice about disease. Even when outbreaks were rare, these customs guided behavior and reinforced communal responsibility, quietly shaping social norms. Medical knowledge evolved gradually through careful observation. Physicians documented symptoms, compared cases across regions, and refined treatment approaches. Although cures remained limited, the systematic recording of information laid the foundation for modern epidemiology and public health systems. Archaeological and environmental evidence complements historical records. Mass graves, skeletal analysis, and artifacts reveal details about affected populations, while climate patterns and rodent populations helped explain the timing and severity of outbreaks. These findings offered a broader understanding of how the plague interacted with both human and natural environments. The plague's influence is subtle, but enduring. It shaped governance, urban design, social behavior, trade, and medical knowledge. Its presence moved slowly from immediate crisis to historical reference, leaving a legacy embedded in habits, infrastructure, and collective understanding. Thank you for listening to this episode of Sleeping History. If you enjoyed learning about the plague, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more calming historical stories. Feel free to leave a comment with what topic you would like us to explore next. Good night, and may your sleep be peaceful as history continues quietly around us.